Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Katherine Daniell, and I'll be introducing our first keynote speaker of the Social Responsibility of Algorithms workshop for this year. And I'll remind you that this session will be recorded, and we ask that you hold any questions until after the speaker has finished her talk, but of course you may put them in the chat as we go along, and we have someone who's looking at that. So I am very pleased to invite Doaa Abu-Elyounes to the stage, or our virtual stage here. Doaa Abu-Elyounes is currently working at UNESCO on the ethics of artificial intelligence. She's also an affiliated researcher at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, and a postdoctoral researcher at the Ecole Normale Superieure in Paris. And Doaa obtained her PhD from Harvard Law School and researches the topic of algorithmic governance and the different ways to regulate artificial intelligence. She also has extensive experience working on public policy at the national and international level. And she joins us today with a talk entitled "The Role of Technology Assessment Tools in Ensuring that AI Benefits All." Welcome, Doaa, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Katherine, and thank you to all of the rest of the organizers, Liz, Alexis, and others. Thanks for having me. It's very great to be here. I wish we can be next time in person together. And I really like the format of the conference of case studies and discussions. So congratulations on putting that together. Let me share my screen. Very good. Okay, great. So good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I believe it's really relevant in this case when we really have people from all over the world. I will talk today about algorithmic governance and about the trends that emerge in the last couple of years in governing artificial intelligence, and about two specific tools, quantitative tools, that would hopefully help us to move from the more kind of general trend that we are seeing of governing through principles to a more practical and action-oriented governance. So as I mentioned, in the last couple of years, the strongest trend in governing artificial intelligence is governing through principles. Those are called in different names: principles, recommendations, codes of conduct, guidelines, and they are being created by different actors. They emerge in the private sectors, in a collaboration between different companies or within companies, by international organization. Katherine mentioned that I work at UNESCO, and we launched our recommendation on the ethics of AI in last November. Prior to us, there was the OECD that is very active in the stage. And as you can see from the numbers, the OECD itself tracked more than 700 policy initiatives on AI, and GPI, the Global Partnership on AI, in 2020 released a paper, kind of a report tracking down the initiatives that are explicitly about responsible AI, and those are 214 initiatives. So in 2016, there has been a series of horrific incidents that were caused by AI, discriminatory incidents. I'm sure all of you heard about some of them, like the ProPublica case that was very famous in the US, when AI system falsely flagged Black defendants twice as risky compared to white defendants, about the Amazon algorithm that its hiring system that was biased against women, about the Microsoft bot that was released to the public to kind of chat with public and became very homophobic, xenophobic, and very biased toward minority groups, so they had to shut it down. So agreement, I mean, that AI has to be governed and some rules had to be put in place. It was easy to reach that stage, but what kind of rules and how binding they are, that is still an open question until today. And there was a shift from, just governing AI and putting AI to something more responsible or social or ethical. Again, in terms of terminology, we have the terminology vary a lot, but we are seeing in the last couple of years this trend. So you might have kind of understood my criticism toward the soft law kind of format of governance, but it is important also to note the benefits, and there are quite many actually. Soft law, it's easier to reach agreement on in terms of converging stakeholders. We have noticed that very much firsthand in the UNESCO recommendation, where it has been adopted by 193 member states. And reaching agreement with such a huge amount of countries was a challenging stage. And this is on a non-binding recommendation level. So even that, so the European Commission is working now on a more binding instrument on the AI Act, and the Council of Europe is working on a treaty. But agreeing on something that is more open-ended is certainly much easier. Also, in recommendations, it's easier to include kind of values and principles that have not yet materialized into hard law. So our recommendation at UNESCO is focused, for example, on ethics. And the reason that we focus on ethics is that it allows us to talk both about human rights and fundamental freedoms that are well anchored in international law and in most national contexts, but also to include other principles like fairness and sustainability and others. The declaratory and rhetorical value of soft law instruments is also important, and it's easier for them to withstand technological changes, because the whole discussion about what is AI and what form of AI are we governing, where the technology is way faster than the lawyers act. So recommendation could be more overarching in that sense and include also future-looking technology. Also, such recommendation can serve as an accountability mechanism by civil society organizations and media organizations to hold governance or private companies accountable to what they signed up for. In a blog post published as part of the AI Now Institute Lexicon on AI, Professor Katherine and I digged deeper into the socially responsible initiatives on AI and tried to identify their characteristics. We came up with a broad group into three characteristics for AI AI for social good initiatives. They're often broad, aspirational, and hollow. They focus on the positive social impact of AI. They often are linked with achieving some of the SDGs, 2030. They require multi-stakeholder engagement, and they often talk about social justice. Second characteristic is their focus on neglected societal needs. They often try to touch on big issues like poverty, global hunger, climate change, etc. And lastly, they often separate the social impact from the economical impact. So so in terms of the AI for social good initiative, they often focus on education, safety, health, well-being, welfare, but they often look at it in a disconnected way from the economical impact. This feature actually contributes to the further marginalization of disadvantaged groups and minorities because those initiatives are often viewed as less profitable or as initiatives that that do not, basically less profitable. So why should we move from principles to practice? I hope, based on all the examples I gave thus far, the answer is rather clear. But still, there are 5 ethical risks that have been identified by Flaherty 2019, that can happen if we stay at the general level of principles. So ethics shopping refer to the practice of basically companies being able to select the principles among the whole long list of principles. They are able to select the ones that they like, or the ones that are easier for them to fulfill. Ethics washing basically refers to the practice of creating advisory groups and mechanisms that are, again, not very strong in terms of enforceability, etc. Ethics lobbying is a practice of, again, mainly private company wanting to remain at this level, high level of generality, and use ethics as a reason why regulation should not be existing. Ethics dumping is interesting. It refers to the practice of exporting unethical practices, like what happened in the case of the Cambridge Analytica, where algorithms for content moderation and management were trained in Nigeria and other countries where the laws are less strong, and then they were implemented in the US, in the UK, for malicious purposes, but basically training the data in one place and then exporting to the algorithm elsewhere. And lastly, ethics shirking is how the impact of the technology is not applied equally on what is happening in the context of the gig economy, how, for example, in the profiles of Uber drivers, while the minority are some that are able to enjoy conversations with others while being retired and using it as a fun activity, or a leisure activity, something to fill the time. The majority is using it as a major source of income without the benefits that are entailed. And the same for Airbnb, the part of the population that is able to benefit from the ability to rent a second house, perhaps, or a main house and go on vacation is very specific. In addition, despite the rise in the research about fairness and other principles, those topics about encountering gender and racial biases in AI remained least researched, and translating the principles into specific practices is hard. So the example of the social welfare, of using algorithms in social welfare, demonstrates very clearly the need to move from principles to practice. Philip Alston, published reporter of the UN on extreme poverty, released a report about the digital welfare. It was called the Digital Welfare Dystopia. His observation was that algorithms are being sold to governments with a huge promise to do good and to change kind of existing practices. So like inserting more neutrality into processes. So he identified 5 types of ways in which AI is being used in welfare, like identity verification, eligibility assessment, where individuals are going through computed a long process, online process, to determine their eligibility to certain welfare benefits, social scoring, and fraud prevention. Now, while it seems appealing to basically assume that the algorithms will bring more neutrality into the process, basically they were causing much more surveillance. And the people that are being surveilled are not all the population, are those who need the welfare the most. So in an article where I examined specific two types of welfare systems, AI used in fraud prevention, welfare fraud, one from the Netherlands and one from the US, from Michigan, the surveillance factor became very evident because the algorithm that was used in the Netherlands for child care benefits, fraud in child care benefits, it allowed the government to put people under surveillance for a period that can go up to 2 years, just to kind of track and see whether the suspicion that they have about a certain person is true, and whether there are reasons to kind of move forward and cut their benefits, etc. And in addition, there was a move from like the ability to communicate with a welfare kind of officer and to that will fill up the application, understand your case, to a screen level bureaucracy, which is basically putting a screen between the individuals, the beneficiaries, and the bureaucrats, the street level bureaucrats, what they were called in the earlier time, the welfare officers. Basically, overall, this caused a reduction in welfare benefits, and governments usually rush to implement those technology in the hope of achieving faster results without putting in place the proper mechanisms that can protect everyone, but especially those that are going to be using the system the most, the vulnerable societies, communities. Okay, well, I talked a lot about why we need to move from a generic kind of level of governance to something more specific. But how to do that? One way is by unpacking principles like fairness and transparency in the specific context. So the article I referred to previously when I talked about the welfare is an article where I examined what is human in the loop. What does it mean, especially in the context of welfare fraud? And what are the characteristics? Because again, saying human should be in the loop, it doesn't mean anything because as I saw in the case of the algorithm used in the Netherlands, the human is only getting involved after a person is put under surveillance for 2 years. And even if a human is involved, if the human is expected to review a huge amount of applications, just that the AI surveilled, it almost becomes as a rubber stamp. The second way to move from principles to practice is through sectorial regulation, particularly in the context of healthcare and autonomous vehicles. We are seeing more and more guidelines that are specific to AI and aim to, again, slightly unpack those concepts of accountability and fairness in the context of healthcare or autonomous vehicles. And third, which is the core of my focus, is the assessment tools, basically tech assessment tools for ensuring that AI is beneficial for all. There are many types of existing indices that basically governments are using: regulatory impact assessment, environmental one. Those two are the oldest one, but they are more, at least the regulatory one, is used more in a bureaucratic manner. In Europe, at least, the idea is to assess the budget before regulation is passed, the budget that is needed for implementing it. There are like newer concepts or relatively recently enacted into laws, like the privacy impact assessment, data protection impact assessment, that in some cases as part of the GDPR, they have to be conducted. I want to focus on, again, very specifically on two tools, on ethical impact assessment tool and on readiness methodology, which are tools that we are currently developing now at UNESCO as a response to the recommendation, I mean, as an attempt to implement the recommendation. Let me start by focusing on the readiness methodology, and I just want to pause and say that the reason I'm talking about those tools is because I think they have a great potential to help us in moving from principles to practice, and also because we are at the midst of their development, and input is very much needed. So all of you can hopefully help us to contribute to the shape of how those tools would look like. So let me start by talking about the readiness tool. The readiness methodology is a tool that will assist how prepared countries are in terms of implementing AI in different domains. And based on the readiness results, we can help then countries to improve their status on the readiness scale by capacity building. So we have reviewed what are the existing readiness methodologies. There are, of course, more generic ones, but there are ones that are more relevant to the AI. The tools that are more relevant to AI are the most relevant ones are the Oxford Readiness Index, the Oxford Government Readiness Index, and the Stanford Index that is being published every year. Now, those tools rank basically countries on how they are doing in terms of readiness. But we found out that readiness in the context of those tools means mainly technological infrastructure and technological readiness. So basically, social issues are not addressed as well in those indices. In the Oxford Index, for example, the last version included the responsible use of AI. And not surprisingly, perhaps, the countries that ranked the highest on the responsible index, the responsible use index, were not at all the same countries that were ranked in the general index. Like the responsible use countries were mainly the Nordic, Baltic countries, while on the general index, also countries like the US and the UK were included. And one of the factors that contributed to the reduction in the score in the responsible use is the existence of surveillance companies in the country, AI used for surveillance, and the lack of ethical framework. The Stanford Index, again, these are issues that we see that the developers of those indices starting to pay attention to, because the Stanford Index now, it does include a chapter on AI ethics, but the way ethics there is being measured is about how much, in terms of like the main conferences on AI, how they address ethics, and how, what is the growth in the existing indices in terms of how many papers are being submitted to those conferences with ethics in the title, or addressing ethics in the topic. In UNESCO, the way we are trying to address readiness is, as I mentioned, to focus more on the ethical and social components. We will do that through 5 dimensions. And each one of those dimensions will include an ethical or social focus. So we have the regulatory dimension, for example, that will look at how whether the country has national AI strategy, whether the country has data protection law, but also way more specifically, whether the national AI strategy include like budgetary allocation, because this could be a good indication of a real commitment of the country to focus on this topic. Social and cultural dimension will target issues like inclusivity, gender inclusivity, and public acceptance of AI technology. And then the economical dimension and the scientific dimension will look at things like how many, again, like this, what Stanford one is looking at how many papers, how many patents in terms of AI in the country are being published, but not just generally, more focused on ethics. And in terms of education, like whether there is education for scientists, computer scientists, about the ethical implication of the technology, not just about the technology per se, and about the courses, available courses for the general public. And we have the technical dimension again, that was a similar, I'm reaching the end of my 25 minutes, so I'll go through this quickly. But as I mentioned, those dimensions are in the process of being kind of developed, and indicators are being attached to each one of them. So in case you feel like you can contribute to either one of them, please be in touch. In terms of impact assessment methodology, this is the second tool I want to talk about. So this is a tool that will assess specific algorithms and how ethical, what is their impact on individuals, on societies, and on the environment, for example. So this tool will assess the impact of, it's aimed at developers of the technology and on the governments as developer and deployer of the technology. And it will go through all the stages, the different stages of the AI life cycle. Here we have many impact assessment tools for AI that were developed. Some by governments, like the government of Canada developed the tool, the UK, I believe also, if I'm not mistaken, the Australian government. A standardization organization like IEEE and ISO published some, and at the midst of developing others. And even private companies, they developed kind of tools for assessing the impact of AI. So 27 tools we identified in total. The tools that have been developed in the companies, in private companies, were tools that kind of require more technical expertise to be conducted because they run through the code, rather than the tools that have been developed by governments or civil society organization. Again, here too, the social issues are not addressed as thoroughly as we hoped they would be, despite the high number of tools. The scope of the tools are often broad, while some of them try to unpack some of the principles, the common principles like fairness and transparency. The majority still remain at a high level of generality. They often don't cover all the AI life cycle. And as I mentioned, they require extensive technical expertise to be conducted. Mainly also, they are all voluntary, the majority of them are voluntary. So we rely on the kind of the goodwill of governments or companies to conduct and to show, and there is never a mechanism for reporting to the public the results of the impact assessment. So the output of the examination is not necessarily useful. in our tool, we are hoping to basically incorporate the feedback from examining all the other tools, and to cover, as I said, all the AI lifecycle, including issues of environment and gender equality that are lacking in other tools. And we hope to create something that is usable by as many stakeholders as possible. Of course, this is a huge challenge because finding kind of the lowest common denominator comes with kind of compromises that we have to do, that we have to create something that is usable by all, but still kind of thorough enough to cover different contexts and domains. So thank you very much. I kind of ran through a lot of issues in kind of a short amount of time. I'm very happy to discuss further and look forward to hear your feedback.
Thank you so much, Doaa, for that really rich and wonderful talk with so many different examples. As you said, we'd now like to open up the floor for questions. So if I can ask everyone to use the raise hand gesture on Zoom. If you're having troubles, just take your microphone off and I should see you, or else you can put your questions in the chat and our colleague Liz will ask the question for you. Liz, I understand, is there already one in the chat that you would like to ask?
There is one from Kathy. If we move from principles to practice, does this change who is doing the ethical AI work? And does this work move from policymakers to practitioners? And if so, what skills do these practitioners need and where might those practitioners work?
Very good question. Thank you very much, Kathy. So I think it's complicated in a way that, like, moving from principles to practice, it's a requirement for everyone. Policymakers, I mean, there are so many layers, right, that we talked about, like the policy makers that are responsible for creating the actual laws. So their role would be to kind of, you know, maybe to create more binding regulation in terms of unpacking the principles and thinking about where regulation is most needed. Practitioners, so yeah, what type of practitioners? Like developers of the technology. I mean, this is the challenge when we talk, for example, about impact assessment, because the technology is usually built in such a decentralized way, and every kind of department is focused on a different aspect of the technology, and then everything kind of comes together into one algorithm that sometimes this algorithm is embodied in another product. So how do you, who is even able to, what kind of practitioner is able to conduct the impact assessment is one of the biggest kind of challenges that we are encountering, because I mean, either you have one ethical officer, but then it's a one person that is responsible for such a huge amount of work that they are not able to go to the actual substance, or it's might become like a very decentralized and slightly even cumbersome process, because it requires kind of everyone to come together to answer kind of this questionnaire. But yes, I mean, I think if we are kind of embodying this idea that we have to do that, we have to be very concrete in our development, in our policy work, in our advocacy work as well. If we kind of shift gears and this becomes like kind of the state of mind, everyone has a role in that. I don't think it's shifting kind of the power, but it's like a more shifting of the state of mind and understanding your specific role. Perhaps it could be like learning more about new kind of domain, a way to kind of translate your work into a different language, into a language that's understood by a broader type of audience. Yeah, I hope that makes sense.
That's a great response, Doaa. While we're waiting for other questions, I was really interested in how you just said there that, you know, who is going to do them is going to be a real challenge. Have you seen how, for example, some of the first impact assessments that are really common that you wrote up, are there any similarities in, say, environmental impact assessments or social impact assessments that could link to the, say, the laws being developed in Europe? Do you see that there are any pathways that might make a particular form of implementation practiced?
You are talking about similarities between them?
Yeah, so for example, you know, if you must do an environmental impact assessment under the law, there are certain places and many of the people involved will need to do bits of that work so that the impact assessors can do that. Do you see any similarities of things that could work better than others?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a good point. I mean, also if we require, you know, both environmental impact assessment and regulatory impact assessment and privacy and data protection, like then we just end up like doing impact assessment the whole time without actually either coming up to a conclusive results or to having, you know, time to develop and to it becomes a cumbersome process. So while we are not thinking about like a contextual approach right now, we are kind of building something that is generic enough to cover both all contexts. For example, in Europe, it's the other way around. The idea is to require this impact assessments only for like high risk algorithms, but and this might be an approach that countries will decide that, you know, that they want to do because of the amount of work entailed with that. And it might be also our second kind of step. Like right now we are trying to have something more general and later on, but yeah, perhaps, I mean, algorithms that impact more people that are in more sensitive domain, I guess they might be merit more attention.
That's great, excellent. And we have two more hands up. Fred, please ask your question.
Okay, well, thank you. That was a great talk. I learned a lot. I'm wondering whether some of the EIA and some of the other indices maybe that UNESCO is developing, will they be a little bit like some of the gender equality indices that the UN and other organizations develop with a bunch of sub-indices and ability to compare how one country is doing versus another? Or is that one of the purposes, and is that how somehow it will be developed?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Indeed, when we think especially about readiness, and we, as I mentioned, we will examine how the country is doing. So it's always like in comparison to other countries, right? But it's kind of like a sensitive, I mean, like it's a kind of like a delicate balance that we have to work with, because we are not able to rank actually countries and to give them, we are not able to score countries and to create this notion of scoring. But at the end of the day, we will have, you know, like a gold standard in a way, or like the readiness. If you kind of answer yes to all the questions, it would definitely mean that you are more ready compared to others. So the idea, it will be a dashboard, absolutely, and it will be displayed publicly open, so people are going to be able to see where are the gaps in their countries compared to what is done in other countries. And that is the whole idea behind it, is to learn from shared experiences. So after the analysis is done, we will work using local experts on, for example, a country that doesn't have a national AI strategy, on how to develop it and what are the components to be included in it for it to be meaningful. So kind of yes and no in short, but yeah, I mean, people will be able to see and then compare, but not in a kind of like a strong numbers score kind of way.
Great, thank you so much.
We
I think
have
we'll now move to Liz, who has a number of questions from the chat. Is that right, Liz?
That's correct. We do. They've been coming in. The first one's from Joseph. He says, indices and impact assessments often become a form of algorithmic process themselves. Is there a potential for ethical impact assessments to be applied to themselves?
Good question. Yes, that's indeed also what I was getting at when I was replying for like environmental impact assessment. It takes a toll on countries to fill in each one of those tools and to comply with it, and not on countries, on companies as well, on big companies, let alone on smaller, medium-sized and smaller size companies that don't have the human capital that bigger companies have. So it's like, suggesting that we need AI to solve the AI problems, right? So this is definitely an issue that we are keeping in mind. So when we are talking about environmental impact assessment, for example, we're trying to think, what can we take from existing indices, like a specific chapter. We're not going to ask companies or countries to do like the full-fledged environmental impact assessment analysis, but perhaps there could be like a multi-layer kind of system where the first layer we ask very kind of basic questions that will give us an idea, and then based on the response in certain kind of cases where we see that the impact is very severe on the environment, then we'll tell them, okay, here you have to dig more and do more on environmental impact assessment. And if the impact is more severe on privacy or on human rights, that's where you need to dig more. But we're thinking about like this kind of, but thank you. This is a very important issue.
Thank you, Doaa. My next question is from Mina, who first of all says, amazing talk, thank you. You mentioned that most assessment tools do not cover the full AI lifecycle. Can you please elaborate more on this, and in particular, how you see assessment of AI tools after they've been decommissioned? He's asking because he's currently working in that space and would love to hear your opinion or potentially invite you to collaborate if you're keen.
Thank you. Sure, happy to talk more. The AI life cycle. So again, every question is like open a big window to like another set of questions, like what is the AI life cycle? Like, right, we don't have a defined list of stages, but yeah, I think we can broadly kind of talk about the pre kind of development, like the research, the data collection, the data analysis, like matching the kind of the outcome and the wanted outcome to the feasibility kind of test, we can call it, and then the actual kind of development process, and of course like post-assessment, how are we doing, how often this tool is being tested, etc. So we hope to do something that covers both ex post and ex ante kind of assessment. And the ex ante part is really important, because this is where many algorithms are failing. And I saw that in the context of welfare, or also in the context of criminal justice. So once you go kind of context specific, you realize that how often the tools are revalidated and tested is something, and also it's part of like this trend that I talk about, the rush. Okay, I want the algorithm because it is going to give me a response to a social problem that I have as a governor right now, and I want it to be solved as soon as possible. And then, we have something, and then maintenance and post kind of testing seems to be something that is always, not getting enough budget allocation and not getting enough attention. So in the testing phase, there is a lot that can be tested in terms of performance, in terms of how the situation compares to the previous like state of the art when the task was done by a different system or by human beings, and issues like that. Yeah.
Thank you, Doaa. We have 2 more questions and then we're going to close for the night. So this next question is from Lauren, and she asks, how do you and your team think about dignity in the context of impact assessments? Have you seen any interesting ways of turning dignity into practice?
Very interesting question, Lauren. Thank you. So for our, in the recommendation, dignity appears many times, usually as part of when we talk about human rights, human dignity, kind of like fundamental freedoms. And we do have that as a value that has to be protected. And this is like, the values are very important, because if we think about the recommendation as a pyramid, the values are, you know, like the bottom that holds everything together. And then from that, you know, we kind of branch into more concrete stuff. And when we talk about impact assessment, we kind of like run into the challenge of translating everything. And so some things might be more, you know, intuitive, like transparency. You can think about different ways of achieving transparency, but yet there are more complex, like the values are the ones that are more complex to actually translate into concrete issues. We will assess, you know, compliance with human rights and how this is being done. And then I believe the dignity will be part of that. But if you have other ideas, I'm happy to. Yeah.
Thank you. And final question for tonight from Loki. As a cross-disciplinary practitioner trying to wade through these tools, I wonder what role these processes might play in developing the capacity to conduct ethics assessments, to lead a culture of designing projects to be accessible.
Can you please repeat?
Yeah.
That was a bit fast.
That's okay. He says, I wonder what role these processes might play in developing the capacity to conduct ethics assessments, to lead a culture of designing projects to be accessible.
Yeah, thank you. That's also very important. I talked a bit about, you know, how we are aiming to use those tools to build capacity. So we have 193 member states, as I mentioned, in UNESCO, and those member states are in different level of developments. We have very developed member states with enhanced AI capability, and those that are less developed. And we have to think about capacity, how to make it as a culture. So there is a capacity in terms of how to. So a couple of things. First is how to learn to do those things by design, you know, like ethics by design, privacy by design. So to enhance the capacity to do those things, you know, in advance, before or alongside the development, not to wait until the end to do the impact assessment kind of. But then another thing is because we are going to ask all those questions, the indicators that we are going to create, we'll have to have the collaboration of the countries or the companies to fill them in and tell us what is the status. So we have to develop the capacity of answering those questions. And this data is not, you know, for some of the indicators, the answers are going to be hard. It's not something that we can find with a Google search. So this is something that we are intending to invest in, you know, work with countries on identifying. And sometimes the answer will be, I don't know. I mean, I think it's something that we have to take into account, and then we have to think how then, you know, if we have too many, I don't know, we take a step backward and we say like, okay, so what do we do to collect, like, in order to examine if you have, I don't know, like ethical teaching in universities, for example. So what do you do? Do you look at the top 10 university? Do you look at I mean, like, what are the questions that you can ask that will help you to find this data? So yeah, very, very important.
That's great. Thank you so much, Doaa, for taking so much time and answering all of those questions for us. And I think you landed on a really nice point about, what are the questions that we need to ask? And in fact, that's what we'll be doing over the rest of the workshop. So thank you so much for all of your contributions, and thank you so much to everyone else for your contributions to the discussion today. And now I'll hand over to Liz Williams, who will close today's session.
I will keep this very brief because for some of us it's very late. I just wanted to say we've had a wonderful day today. We've gone from multi-level perspective and facial recognition to a wonderful panel with Virginia Doaa, Peter Coombs, and Julian Vito, to Doaa's wonderful talk. It's been an absolutely fantastic day. We've gotten wonderful questions from all of you, and I really appreciate that. Tomorrow, we will have a case study exploring, it will take us to the Great Barrier Reef. We'll be looking at the future of the Great Barrier Reef with a specific focus on the ways we monitor it at scale. And this one is featuring colleagues from the Australian Institute of Marine Science and the ANU Institute for Water Futures. And it's one you're not going to want to miss. We also have a contribution panel chaired by Alexis Tsoukas, which will feature Amira Sadi and Loren Ruster from the ANU and Meltem Ozturk from CNRS Lamsad. And finally, we'll explore AI from a more material and environmental perspective with a keynote talk from Benedetta Ravini, author of the book, Is AI Good for the Planet? So thank you all for your attention and participation today. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And in the meantime, have a good day, afternoon, or evening.